Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help executives become better cyber risk managers. We are your hosts. I'm Kip Boyle, CEO of Cyber Risk Opportunities.
And I'm Jake Bernstein, Cybersecurity Counsel at the law firm of Newman DeWars.
And this is the show where we help you become a better cyber risk manager.
The show is sponsored by Cyber Risk Opportunities and Newman DeWars, LLP. If you have questions about your cybersecurity related legal responsibilities,
and if you want to manage your cyber risks just as thoughtfully as you manage risks in other areas of your business, such as sales, accounts receivable, and order fulfillment, then you should become a member of our Cyber Risk Managed program, which you can do for a fraction of the cost of hiring a single cybersecurity expert. You can find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and newmanlaw.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today?
Jake, today we're going to talk about active defense.
Well, I guess the first question then is, what is active defense?
Right. Most people probably have not heard of active defense, but it's an up-and-coming strategy. And the hope is that it's going to add new tools for cyber risk management.
What kind of tools? Can you give some examples?
Absolutely. It turns out there's a whole range of activities inside of this idea of active defense. Everything from somewhat more passive things like inserting beacons inside digital data in case they're stolen, all the way to conducting rescue missions to recover stolen data. So if you've got a beacon in your data and it's letting you know what IP address your data is sitting on, then you could go out and you could get it back.
Well, that sounds a lot like hacking back.
It's often confused for the idea of hacking back, but if you want a way to think about it, hacking back is probably more like conducting a destructive activity, right? So if somebody's attacking me, the idea is that I could just, knock their server offline and stop the attack, or I could even go so far as to break into their server and delete their files so that the machine can't even be booted up anymore. But that's hacking back. Active defense is actually somewhere, just short of a destructive activity, and where it fits into the continuum is if you think about hacking back as one extreme, and then on the other extreme, if you think about what we've been doing traditionally, setting up firewalls, patching software, being more passive in our defense. Well, now what we're saying is there's a whole middle ground between those two extremes where we're not going to be destructive, but we're not just going to sit around and wait for people to come and get us.
Okay, so why would we want to do active defense?
Well, so anybody who's in the game right now knows that the passive defense strategies just aren't working as well as they used to. The ideas of perimeter defenses, thinking of my network as a castle, and if I could just build nice, thick, tall walls with single points of control where people can only come in and go out through, one or two or maybe three very tightly managed egress points. That's just not working anymore. And so there's two reasons why that's not working so well anymore. And the first reason is because we've got online criminals and foreign countries out there that are really stepping up their game in terms of attacking us. So, what's that all about? Well, criminals are pretty easy to understand. They want money. And, you think about ransomware and it makes sense. Okay, yeah, ransomware, take my files, charge me money to get my files back. But it's so much bigger than that. I think of it as Al Capone, instead of holding a machine gun and running around town terrorizing people, now he's holding the internet in his hands and he's running around the globe, stealing billions of dollars from individuals, businesses of all sizes, including banks, hospitals, county governments. I mean, really nobody is safe from these online criminals. So that's one dimension here about how things are getting more difficult for our passive defenses. the other thing that's going on in terms of increased threats is foreign governments see the internet as a new battleground, and even the United States sees the internet as a battleground. And it reminds me, when I was in the Air Force, just going into the Air Force, we studied the rise of air power, in the early 1900s, and how that absolutely transformed the way wars were fought. And we're going through a similar revolution now, where cyberspace is becoming a battleground, and it's changing the way that countries fight each other. And so these countries are spending a lot of money learning how to dominate it. And we can see this actually today. Russia has been attacking the Ukraine, and two particular attacks that I think are pretty well covered in the mainstream press. In December of 2015, they caused a major blackout just using cyber weapons. They turned off the power in vast swaths of that country and left people in the dark and freezing. And then in June of 2017, they released a worm called NotPetya. And that worm is so virulent that it ran not only throughout the Ukrainian economy, but all over Europe, and caused well over $1 billion of damages. And then you also have these interesting hybrids like North Korea. So North Korea is a government that's trying to establish some dominance in cyberspace for military purposes. But it also turns out that because they're under such economic sanctions, such severe sanctions, they're hacking for money as well. Interesting hybrid there. Anyway, so what does it all boil up to? Passive defenses aren't working as well as they used to, because the threat's just so severe.
Okay, so I guess one of the questions that I think this raises is it that passive defenses aren't working because they just don't work, or is it they're not working because people aren't using them properly? In other words,
Mm.
is this a situation that we're seeing where passive defenses have been used, executed to near perfection, and they just don't work? Or is it that passive defenses just aren't used properly?
I think it's arguable that it could be a little bit of both. I, I've certainly seen it that passive defenses, such as filtering email, filtering inbound network traffic, properly configuring access controls. I mean, that stuff's kind of difficult to get right all the time, every time, everywhere. So there's always this issue of, are my controls fully installed and are they working fully effectively? And to the extent that they don't, I mean, a defender has to be right in terms of being attacked, right? If you think about their entire attack surface, a defender has to be right all the time, every time, and an attacker only has to be right one time. And then it kind of seems like you're living in a house of cards as far as being a defender goes. But that's not the only reason. Actually, the other thing that's going on, Jake, is that the passive defenses just simply aren't working well against certain types of attacks. And phishing is probably the best example of an attack that our technological defenses are actually really terrible at dealing with,
Mm-hmm.
because the point of a phishing attack is to attack the emotions of the people who receive those
Mm-hmm.
messages.
So maybe another way to think about this then is that it's not, when we're talking about passive versus active defense, we're not necessarily thinking in the same way as we do when we talk about, legal, reasonable security. Because as we've talked about in the past, reasonable security is not perfect security,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe what we're saying here is that maybe the argument in favor of active defense is that, it's one thing to be reasonable under the law, and so maybe I'm not going to be held liable or something. But what if I just really don't want to be attacked effectively? Or what if I don't really care necessarily that, let me rephrase that. What if my legal liability is not anywhere near the top of my list of priorities in terms
Mm.
of not being attacked? For example, if you if you run a hospital, whether or not you have reasonable cybersecurity in place, you simply cannot allow an attacker to turn off your life support machines, right? I
Right.
mean, like you just can't let that happen.
Or remote
So,
control your gamma knife.
or exactly, yeah. So there's a lot of situations where I can see that, the liability aspect is obviously important, but there
Hmm.
are justifications and reasons that rise even above, your liability,
Hmm.
life and death, for example,
Yeah, life
where
safety.
it's just not acceptable.
Right.
So, at that point, um, you're probably thinking about, active defense is starting to look like a more important component. And really what we're looking at here is just expanding the toolbox. Is that a fair way of saying it?
I think a lot of people look at it that way. Is look, we want some more, choices between completely passive things and entirely offensive, destructive things. Like there's got to be something in the middle, right? Because another factor in play here is if you think about armed gunmen
Mm-hmm.
robbing bank branches or thugs, knocking people over the head and stealing their wallets. I mean, in the United States, we really don't see this sort of activity anymore. And a big reason for that is because the government has spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to protect citizens from these types of crimes, and so we just don't see that stuff anymore. And so we can count pretty highly on the idea that when we go to work every day, we're not going to have our wallets stolen from us, or that we're going to, that our bank branches aren't going to get robbed. But in contrast, all this cyber attacking, our government has really very little idea what to do to effectively stem the tide of these attacks, both in terms of the military attacks that we're seeing, as well as the attempts to steal digital assets, money, and intellectual property. And so I think organizations are saying we need more tools because nobody's going to help us. We have to help ourselves somehow. And just having the binary, am I passive or am I destructive, just that's just not enough.
Okay. So, if this is, I guess, why aren't we seeing more organizations using active defense, or is it just too new? Is it new? What is this concept? I mean, how old is this concept?
Yeah, so it's some parts of active defense are actually not that new. If you think about active defense as a continuum of options, right? Again, running to a more passive kind of an activity on one side versus a more aggressive activity on the other side. Well, we've had things called honeypots for years, and a honeypot is like a fake server, and you put fake assets, right? So fake
Mhm.
documents and things like that, fake credentials. You put these things in a honeypot, and the idea is that, and when an attacker shows up, they're going to go for the honeypot first, and since you know that that server is never used for anything legitimate, if you get any alerts at all from that honeypot, well, then you've got an intruder around
Mhm.
because just the very nature of it. So that's something that we've been doing for years, and so it's just a matter there of getting our technology to be more and more effective, so that it becomes difficult for attackers to know that they've actually stumbled on a honeypot, a really amateurish one. Some of these nation states will see it for what it is very quickly and just go right by it without sounding the alarm. So, but
Mhm.
some of the things that are more more active, that have higher impact but also greater risk is like botnet takedowns. So if there's a botnet that's attacking you, right, a collection of computers on the internet, and they're directing a denial of service attack against you, and you don't have denial of service attack protections, what choices do you have except to sit around and twiddle your thumbs and wait for this attack to subside on its own? Well, it would be really nice if you could find the source, like the controller of this botnet, or maybe even the individual bots themselves, and start to take them out. Typically, the government has been doing things like that, or has been doing botnet takedowns by cooperating with private industry to do it. So that's another example
Yeah.
of active defense, but in a more aggressive way. And then, as I mentioned before, probably one of the most aggressive things that you can do in active defense is actually find out who stole your data, go to wherever it's being stored, and then actually retrieve it or delete it. And in the process of doing that, you could actually take down an innocent person's computer services. So there's quite a bit of risk there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it sounds like there's legal questions then involved in using active defenses.
Yeah, that's right. So that's where we need an attorney. Um, what if I go and do some kind of a rescue mission on my data, and let's say that I find out that my data has been stored away on the computer system of a giant pharmaceutical company. So in other words, that the person who stole my data didn't store it on their own servers, but just stashed it in on the server of a third a third party that's uninvolved.
And
Am I legally allowed to do that?
well, I mean, before I answer that question, I think let's just say that let's point out that that would not be an unusual or strange circumstance. Um, a botnet in and of itself is someone using other people's computer resources to
Right.
cause damage, right?
Yep.
And so, if it was hypothetically possible to send a command back to computers that were attacking you and physically cause them to, blow their capacitors and explode, you would ultimately be causing damage not so much to the bad guy, but to all of the victims of the bad guy who just were an earlier stage in his attack.
Right.
So similarly, you know, if I'm going to engage in an industrial espionage attack or some kind of exfiltration of data, it actually makes sense for me to compromise someone else's computers, gain
Oh
control,
yeah.
and then ship everything I steal over to them. So in a lot of ways, the practical effect of this rescue mission concept is that you will end up violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and quite possibly state equivalents like Washington Cybercrime Act, because what's going to happen is ultimately you are going to end up accessing someone else's computer system without authorization. And that
And
is
and not the
that is
criminals.
and not the criminals. And technically speaking, even if it was the criminals, there's no defense to unauthorized access because he did it to me first.
Mm.
I mean, the law could evolve in that direction. You certainly are unlikely to get sued by the victim if the
Hmm.
victim is in fact the criminal. But if the victim isn't the criminal, if
If the victim is this pharmaceutical company that I was imagining.
if this hypothetical pharmaceutical company, we'll call it kind of like victim zero,
Hmm.
um, then not only are you likely to not only are you hacking someone else's computer who's not even a bad guy, but if you cause damage, you're going to be liable under civil actions because the CFAA has a civil component which
Mm.
allows anyone who's hurt under it to file a lawsuit. So it's important to realize that it's not just the risk of criminal prosecution, it's also a defensive technique if you can catch the hacker. You can sue them for
Isn't that
money.
ironic, right? So I get attacked. I use an active defense technique to either stop the hack or to retrieve my stolen assets, and then I get charged with a crime.
Yeah, or you get sued for damages. Yeah, I mean
Right.
it's well, that's part of why this is not fully adopted. And obviously, we are talking about a continuum. You know, um, rescue missions, white hat ransomware, anything where you're actually executing, you know, objectively malicious code, whether you're using it maliciously or not, on someone else's computer.
Hmm.
Um, and really, the law doesn't care about malicious code. It really tends to care about access and whether or not that access was authorized.
Mm.
So you can pretty much see that in all situations that are relevant, a rescue mission is practically going to guarantee, it must involve unauthorized access, right? So I don't see rescue missions being legally tenable at this time.
Unless somebody
On the
comes
other
up
hand,
with a really clever way to do a rescue mission without somehow violating the unauthorized access, prohibition. I mean, I haven't seen anything yet, but technical people can be really clever in devising ways to get this done. In some ways, I'm really looking forward to seeing what some people come up with as to how to do
you,
this.
it's interesting too. I mean, I think that technical people can also get themselves in trouble by trying to be overly clever
Mm,
and not understanding that the law is not a binary computer code that is just run on a machine and it always does the same thing. I've seen this frustration, particularly in um, kind of penetration tester clients of mine who, um, you know, they're so used to thinking in code and computers and things being black and white, one or zero, binary, that when you hit the law and you need to understand that, you know, if something smells like a duck and talks like a duck and walks like a duck, um, even if I can make an argument that it's not a duck, a judge or jury can still say, "Nah, it's close enough. It's a duck,"
hmm
and that kind of imprecision literally can't happen on at least current modern computers, right? It's software can be buggy and things can happen that shouldn't happen, but ultimately, isn't it said that the problem with computers is that they do exactly what they tell you, what you tell them to do,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
the great thing about computers is they do exactly what you tell them to do. It's
yeah.
the same thing. So the way that access and authorization is defined is it can change with the times. It
Mm,
can be modified when something doesn't seem right, even if you might have gamed it.
hmm
So it can be very challenging. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of other choices in the active defense category. A botnet takedown, you might think, is could be construed as doing something damaging,
hmm
but in fact, most of the time, a botnet takedown is a combination of intelligence gathering plus a lawsuit. You will see, for example, that Microsoft's um, cybercrime division has actually taken down some pretty big botnets in conjunction with law enforcement, and they do that without violating these laws. Beacons, denial and deception, sandboxes, honeypots, information sharing, any kind of intel gathering, even if you go onto the dark web, deep web or dark net to do it,
hmm
um, isn't ever really going to involve the CFAA.
Right,
Um, you know,
right.
coordinated sanctions, criminal indictments, trade remedies at the government level. These are all active defenses that are perfectly legal right now.
Yeah.
Um,
And hunting through
and
your own network to see if there's any intruders. I mean, that's no
yeah,
different than going down to your warehouse to see if somebody's hiding in there.
right. It's totally not. And I think if you take active defense to if you analogize to the physical world, and active defense as a concept, of course, originated in the military before the concept of cyber ever came up, right? And so, an example would be, um, imagine a private party thinking that it was justified in conducting a rescue mission with armed guys with guns who go in and potentially kill other people to rescue someone or something that was taken.
Yeah, like maybe their executive was taken
Yeah,
hostage.
right. I mean, even when the military does things like that, there's a relatively fine line you know, a between a military crime and a valid mission.
hmm
So, I think that the law right now recognizes your right to self-defense in the moment, and a private party can deploy lethal force in defense of himself, others, and even in some cases property, although that gets kind of squishy.
hmm
um, but you know if if a burglar comes into my house and um, they take my TV, and I have this little system that has shot a little tracking device onto his pant leg as he leaves, and then I go out the next night and I hunt him, and I confront him in his house, and if it were to become violent, I mean, murder is murder. So there's a lot of you got to be. I think you have to be really careful
And
with
I
how
and I think, yeah,
it's said.
and I think that's really the big risk. If you look at all the different, the range of options defined inside of active defense, and as you said, some of the stuff's very low impact, very not very risky, honeypots and that sort of thing. But it seems to me that once you start dabbling in these things, right? These beacons and threat hunting, you've got to have a lot of self-control to not take what you discover and then say, well, I'm just going to keep following up on this until I get this guy to leave us alone, right? And so in your enthusiasm, you could actually start breaking into other people's computers, and then next thing you know, you're doing stuff that's just plainly illegal according to our current
You
paradigm.
you can, and people often use the term "wild wild west" when describing the internet as a marketplace, right? I think it's starting to mature now, but what we're really looking at here is how much do we want to let the internet become the actual wild west, is which historically was defined as a lawless frontier, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it, you know, might made right in parts of the old west. It wasn't until you got civilization there where you start to impose the rule of law.
Right.
um, and I don't think that people are prepared for that on the cyber realm. I don't think that it is particularly safe to start doing that. um, and I think if you open Pandora's box of rescue missions, um, I I have a feeling that there would be a lot of damage caused to innocent parties in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is a good example of how it's frustrating right now for organizations to wish that the government, the police forces, the FBI, that they would be able to do for us in the cyber realm what they already do for us in the physical world, and they just none of this has really been sorted out yet. So I think active defense is going to become a more and more talked about idea as time goes on. I think we're going to see companies, startups arise to try to provide active defenses for organizations that are willing to try to push the envelope a little bit. So I just think it's going to be really exciting to watch the evolution of law and technology in this space. And I really hope we come up with some good answers, because right now I just feel like a sitting duck.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the future will be. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is going to become regularly used. I mean, I think as much as we can kind of discuss the shades of gray and, maybe even going pretty far into the black on some of these things, a lot of this stuff I think is pretty clearly not that risky legally. Anything you want to do on your own network, um, you know, there's a question of it's not even clear to me that, let me just as a hypothetical, I could potentially put mines in my data network, right?
Hmm.
Like literal infected pieces of malware data that I leave in there as, as traps
Hmm.
for the unwary. And you talk about, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what I just said was difficult or was tricky, which is to make an argument that I'm not ever accessing your computer system with a piece of malware if you stumble upon it and steal it and sorry, it ran on your machine, but
Right.
I didn't do it. You came onto my property
And then you
and
transferred it over to your
you
computer.
you took it, you transferred it. I didn't access your
Right.
computer.
Or to
So
the
there's an
computer of this
yeah,
pharmaceutical company that I've broken into and they used
yeah.
as a launching pad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, hopefully that company has its own system set up to defend
Yeah.
itself. But I mean, I do think that there are, that is a really interesting gray area.
Yeah.
I mean, because I can put a beware of dog sign in my yard, and I can put three attacked German shepherds in there, and if you climb that fence and you get mauled, I'm not really liable under the law. I mean, you violated my property. You ignored a clear warning. Um,
And you got
Sorry,
what you deserved.
you got what you deserved. So you could take it. You could take it that far
Yeah.
with in the cyber realm.
And I
Um,
think that's what people are trying to do with active defense. They're just saying, let's take some of these common sense, kind of ensconced into law ways of protecting ourselves, and let's extend those into the digital realm.
yeah, and I think how far you take that is going to be interesting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Today we talked about active defense and how that may help you better manage your cyber risks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast.
Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport and needs to incorporate management, your legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness.
And management's goal should be to create an environment where practicing good cyber hygiene is supported and encouraged by every employee. So if you want to manage your cyber risks and ensure that your company enjoys the benefits of good cyber hygiene, then please contact us and consider becoming a member of our Cyber Risk Managed program.
You can find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and newmanlaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.